Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Welcome back. We are back. Today is the first day of February. It's February the 1st, 2021. This is podcast number 58. A wonderful year, the year of the 46. I am going to be 46 this year, even though some people try not to let that happen. This is a way of saying that I've had a very difficult time in the last few months. And, some individuals thought it was necessary to play God with my life. But at the end of the day, I shall not be brought down by another man. At the end of the day, they did not win. So I'm here. Anyway, it's been a long break. It was unanticipated. I did not intend to take that long. But again, I had to deal with some personal issues, health issues and whatnot. Even some voodoo issues. I'm going to say some voodoo issues because there were some shenanigans going on. And, some individuals thought it was necessary to bring me down. Apparently, I am too fresh. I am too arrogant, some say. But anyway, I'm here. We're going to have a wonderful podcast, a wonderful season. We're going to be talking about law, crime, obligation. This is going to be a wonderful series of podcasts. And today, we're introducing the first podcast in the series. Without further ado, let us delve right into it. Legal obligation. What is legal obligation? What does it mean to be legally obligated? Now, the term legal obligation is a term that is very popular in political philosophy. In fact, I learned about this term when I was a student. And I had a professor who had a course about the very concept, and we discussed it. Actually, he and we ended up having a very estranged relationship because he didn't appreciate my understanding of the concept. And I remember at the time, he and I had a very peculiar relationship because some of the things that he was saying, which for me represented orthodox viewpoints about the concept of obligation, I refused. I rebuked them. I didn't agree with them. And long story short, I remember when I got my final paper, I ended up getting one of the worst grades in this class, and which made me upset because I knew the professor gave me the worst possible grades, not necessarily because of the work itself, but because of the views I expressed in them, which he at the time didn't agree. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that some of the things that I am about to say here might not jibe with your understanding of legal obligation. You might even consider what I'm about to say radical to some extent, because again, that's the word that I see people throwing out nowadays when they don't agree with your understanding of certain things. They call you radical because they sort of, what you have to say is so much different from what I'm used to hearing that you must be a radical. In any case, I hope you don't consider me that way. I am a philosopher. I am a thinker. I am an intellectual. I have the credentials to prove it. I also have the wit to prove it. So I'll leave it up to you to make up your mind on this one. But the point here is that when we are talking about legal obligation, what we are talking about a legal obligation. There ought to be a law. There ought to be a legal mechanism that makes the obligation compulsory. In other words, you are compelled to do X, Y, and Z because the law says so. And that's the fundamental of the term legal obligation. But there's also the understanding that a legal obligation in and of itself is something inherent. And that is why I can talk about the concept from a philosophical standpoint. The idea that a legal obligation is inherent implies that every person or every reasonable human being would obey the law. And this is where I take issue with that understanding, because every reality, every situation in which we have had the opportunity to watch humanity at play, what we've seen is that people must be forced to be. People must be forced to do certain things. And that is exactly the reason every society has institutions whose job, or who has institution with responsibilities in terms of forcing the citizen. And usually that force is based on threat. A threat of imprisonment, threat of being arrested, threat of paying fines. So there ought to be a threat. There ought to be some sort of an instrument that compels the being. So which brings me to an interesting question. If there ought to be institutions to impose obligations, then why would an obligation be inherent? Why would we somehow think every human being is reasonably inclined to obedience? And that's the fallacy of the whole argument. And that's one of the reasons I remember I had some exchange with my professors at the time, or with my professor, because it was one particular professor who didn't seem to see it that way. And I remember at one point in the class, he suggested that there was the ultimate truth, that everybody knows that truth, everybody's going for that truth. And I'm like, no, if there was an ultimate truth, why would we be looking for it? Because we would know it to be true. We would stop existing as a people. The only reason we strive in this world is because we are looking for a truth. We are looking for something that would prove everything that we're doing is right or either wrong. That's because we don't know. The ones before us didn't know. The people before us didn't know. And the people after us will not know either. It would remain the subjective landscape where people are trying to understand why things are, who we are. And I think we will never find it. We will never come to a conclusion as to who we are. We could definitely say this is where we are at some point. But who we are, why we are, those questions would remain unanswered for forever. Forever. Because there's a subjective nature in the concept. So when we talk about legal obligation, we have to consider this subjective nature. But there's also certain realities which are undeniable, to the extent that I mentioned before, that every law must be enforced. And since every law must be enforced, then obedience to that law is not inherent. Obedience is not innate. People must be compelled to obey. People must be forced to obey. Otherwise, they would not do so. Now, this brings us to an interesting question. That is, if a person decides not to obey the law, does that mean that this individual is irrational? Does that mean that this individual is inherently a bad person? Does that mean that this person is in bad faith? Why would somebody not want to obey the law? Well, the answer is simple. It's against our nature to obey. It's against human nature to obey. Obedience is a construct. It is a social construct that is relative to the environment in which you are confined. If you're not confined, you don't have any obligation to obey. Because the only time you are obligated is when you are confined to a particular place, to a particular milieu where your existence is incumbent upon your obedience. So that obedience is not innate. That obedience is compulsory because of the condition in which you as a person finds yourself. It has nothing to do with rationality. Has nothing to do with something intrinsic in the being. All it has to do is that if you are confined, so long as you understand your confinement, you will be compelled to obey whatever law that sets the frame for your confinement. So when we talk about legal obligation or legal obedience or citizen obedience, what we are talking about individuals being confined in a particular social milieu in which their confinement requires them to obey. So obedience in no way, shape, or form is innate, is inherent, or is intrinsic in the being. Every law must be enforced, because if it is not enforced, nobody will give a hoot about it.